Hey y'all, and welcome to another episode of the One Hood Power Hour. Back again this week. We have a really exciting episode planned for y'all. This week we're going to be focused on, building international solidarity and community around several ongoing issues and conflicts and movements, in different countries around the globe. So we're expanding outward from just the local and the statewide again this week, and really drawing those important connections between the local, the statewide, the countywide, and those larger international and global issues and movements. So for our guest this week, we're really excited and grateful to be joined by Andres Franco from City of Asylum, Pittsburgh, to be talking about the widespread protests and movements that have been going on in Colombia. We'll also be joined by Mieza Gede from Amna Tigray to talk about the ongoing conflicts in Tigray, Ethiopia. And then we'll also be joined by Omar Musa from the Palestinian Youth Association of Pennsylvania to talk about the ongoing crises in Palestine. And lastly, but not least, our very own Farouk Al-Said to be talking about, the ongoing indigenous issues in Canada and the recent discoveries of burials and mass graves. And so on that note, I will pass it off to my colleague who I'm joined with again tonight, Miracle Jones, just to talk a little bit more about the episode, see if she has any hot takes she'd like to mention before we jump into that.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Ryan. So we know for over the past year, there's been a lot of uprisings. Black people commonly refer to what's going on as the George Floyd protest, and as people have been mobilizing and fighting, and we do want to take a moment to acknowledge, what's happened in the last 24 hours in Minneapolis, in conjunction with organizing and protest, and understanding that what is happening, in Minneapolis is happening all over the world, where people are organizing and fighting back against state violence and pushing for freedom and equity and equality. And so we thought it was very important that we touch on a lot of these international issues, because the local is global, the global is local, and there are people who have been resettled and have people who have been made refugees all around this country because of these issues. And so we thought it was very important that we talk about how our liberations are intertwined, how we're all connected, and trying to as we build this global community, how we can show up in solidarity for one another. And so we're very excited to have our panelists today speak about that. And in addition, it's been a busy week. Both our national elected officials and our local elected officials have been very busy introducing legislation, introducing various bills. We know Pennsylvania is again on the national stage, facing scrutiny about a potential audit that people are trying to push here in Pennsylvania to once again ensure that the presidential election results are the presidential election results. And so this is still going on as we enter into our general primary season for our November 2nd election, which rolls into the 2022 Senate race. So it's going to be very interesting to see what's going on and how that's going to turn out. There's a lot of criminal justice legislation coming down, and we're supposed to be, I know I mentioned George Floyd earlier, the policing bill is supposed to be introduced in the next couple of weeks in Congress. And so there's a lot of things that people are paying attention to when it comes to politics that we all are going to have to wait to see what's going to happen. There's a lot of negotiations forthcoming. And so it's very interesting past 72 hours just in politics and what's coming on. And so I'll turn it back over to Ryan.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Miracle. Yeah, and just drawing more international, more global parallels on top of what you were talking about, with the election results in Pennsylvania and here in the U.S. Just along those same lines, related to elections and positions of power. We saw within the last 24 hours, I believe this was yesterday, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was ousted as Prime Minister of Israel by a joint coalition in a very very contentious and narrow vote. So I'm sure that'll come up during our discussion of Palestinian and Israeli issues later on in the show. And then along those same lines, there's the continued controversies around the delayed elections in Ethiopia that are currently set again for this fall. So again, I'm sure that's something that'll come up in our discussion of the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia as well. So really, in pretty much every issue that we talk about, from a statewide or a national level, I think it's really important to always emphasize that there are those parallels internationally and globally also.
Yeah, and think about that, we were also looking at how people are responding, the right to people to protest, to organize, to galvanize, as we're seeing again with legislation being introduced to punish folks who are protesting, to allow people to drive through protests. And we're seeing this locally, but also on a international level. Russia is talking about bringing back work, making prisoners work for a lot of people who are prisoner and abolitionist rights organizations are very, concerned about the way people are responding to violence, how people are turning to prison labor. And so when at a time we're supposed to be reducing the global prison population, we're actually increasing it. We're also looking at, COVID-19 still being here, still being around, what's going on with the possible impending Olympics. What does that mean for labor rights issues and labor organizers? Because people are literally saying that this Olympic Games in Japan could be the biggest super spreader event that we have yet to see. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how the world stage is responding. We have the ongoing G7 summit what's happening right now, and people are again debating who gets access to vaccines. We have learned through social media that places like Venezuela do not have access to the vaccines because of the blockades that are impacted on a national level from some of the G7 countries. And so again, whatever we're talking about will always have this international side and component to it, which again is why we're very excited to have the program that we are having this evening.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great segue to our first guest. As we move to talking about the current situation in Colombia and some background information on that with our first guest, who has that that cultural and personal perspective. As we see that movement down there being fueled by the police response to those protests initially, being fueled by the government's response to the COVID crisis, and how all that's been handled as well. So yet another parallel to the situations we see up here. And I think on that note, that's a great time to bring in our first guest, Andres Franco, who is the executive director at City of Asylum Pittsburgh. So we can go ahead and bring him in on now.
Hi, Ryan. Hi, Miracle. How are you tonight?
Good. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. And it is really a pleasure for me to be joining this conversation tonight. So yes, I'm the executive director of City of Asylum as of last October. And I was born in Colombia. I have lived here in the United States for the last 20 years and in Pittsburgh for the last 6. So I would definitely like to share some of my personal opinions on the situation in Colombia, as well as some background stories. And you were talking about the parallels between what's happening in the United States, what has happened in the United States and the world. And I was thinking that if I told you a couple of things about Colombia without telling you the name of the country, you would be confused. For instance, I'll go to tell you about this country where we have presidential elections, and the president is elected to serve for 4 years and can be re-elected to serve for an additional 4 years. A country that has a Congress made of 2 chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. A country that has historically had 2 mainstream parties. And I could go on and on and on. One of the other things that I could share is that a country that was surprised by the results of an election in 2016. And no, I'm not talking about the United States of America. I'm talking about Colombia. And the election that I'm talking about was actually a national referendum on peace accords that had been being negotiated for a number of years. And that was 2016, the same year where we had the presidential election here in the United States, and the same year when Brexit was passed in the UK. That same year, the same sense of shock at the results was felt by many Colombians. The country had been in this armed conflict since the 1960s, since 1964, in a guerrilla war against the 2 groups, the FARC, F-A-R-C, and the ELN. And the government had been in negotiations with the FARC group for a number of years, and finally came to these peace accords, and they submitted those to a national referendum. And everyone thought, or many people thought, that it would just pass. And they woke up in shock the next day when it was actually rejected. And a lot of what we are seeing happening in Colombia over the last 6 weeks or so is a direct result of what happened on that day in October. But also it's very interesting to see how, in general, Colombian politics have played to take us to this point. So basically, when those peace accords were rejected, everything was in turmoil, because many people thought that it was a chance for the country to move forward and to leave behind that past of war and violence, and be able to start building something new. And then we had presidential elections 2 years later. The country was very polarized. I think the margins between the yes vote and the no vote were razor thin. And again, a couple of years later, we had presidential elections where we had a left of center candidate and a right-wing candidate vying for the presidency. None of them was able to get the majority vote in the first round, so they have to go into a second round of voting. And the current president, Iván Duque, was elected. And he ran on an anti-peace accords platform. So he really slowed down the implementation of those accords. And this last round of protests is at the very least the second one. Very soon after he took the presidency in 2019, there was also widespread protests that at the time were the largest protest in memory. What we are living right now in Colombia dwarfs what happened in 2019. Something else that we have to take into account is COVID-19 and how it has really impacted everyone around the world. Colombia, despite this history of violence, had been able to start getting, pulling people out of poverty was very important, and they were on an upward trajectory until COVID-19 hit. And then when that happened, the poverty, people living before poverty line went to 42.5% of the population. So, Colombia right now has about 51 million people total. So we have 21 million people living below the poverty line, which, just to put all of this in context, the poverty line in Colombia is individuals who survive on $92 or less per month, or $370 for a family of 4. And that is what is called monetary poverty. There's also another group of people it's called by the government extreme poverty. And those are individuals living on $40 or less per month. And that number also went up to 15%. So what happened during COVID-19 is that we we have in Colombia a large segment of the population is part of the informal economy. And what happened was with the shutdown, people were not able to go out and sell things, perform services. They had to stay home, and that had really a terrible impact on people's livelihoods. And after a year of crisis, the government decided to pass a tax reform. They were trying to find ways to finance universal basic income, just to make sure that those who are not able to make a living at least are getting money and are able to afford food. But they went about it the completely wrong way, because most of the tax increases went to the middle class, which was already impacted by COVID-19. And that was what started the current protests. They started on April 28th. They were initially against the tax reform, and the government really did not handle the crisis very well. Eventually, the Minister of Finance did resign, and the government withdrew the tax reform. But by then it was too late. There were many undercurrents. The tax reform was what ignited the protests, but there was a lot of tension underneath. And it is tension that goes back decades. And if you think about it, it really goes back hundreds of years, all the way to when the Europeans came into the Americas, and the time when they started colonizing the quote unquote New World, when they started bringing slaves, when they starting to create the countries that we have today. Another parallel in Colombia is that you have the similar basic populations to what we have here in the United States. You have the native Colombian Indians who were in the territory. You have the Europeans. You have the Africans, which were brought as slaves by the Europeans. And you have that mixture of cultures. Of course, the Europeans that settled in Colombia were primarily from Spain. And that's how the country was created. So in many ways, we are dealing with the aftermath of hundreds of years of struggle, of exploitation. And in the particular case of Colombia, despite being a country with a lot of natural resources, there's incredible inequity. And if anything, that inequity has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. So what you're seeing right now is just a number of movements led by young people, by indigenous people of Colombia, by Afro-Colombians, by unions, by people who are fed up of not having opportunities, of political corruption. I think a lot of the resources in Colombia are really stolen by corrupt politicians, and even by a tax code that allows the wealthiest segment of the population to avoid paying taxes, while the rest of the organization, the rest of the population, more resources. So that is something that is happening right now in Colombia.
Thank you so much for that breakdown. Is there any type of ask or ways that people are able to support people in Colombia, or people whose family members are here locally who are impacted by what's going on with the protests?
There are a number of NGOs. I think what is happening right now is there is an office of the ombudsperson in Colombia, but what's happening right now is that people are very afraid, very disenchanted with the institutions. The riot police has had really disproportionate response to the ongoing protests, and a lot of people are unaccounted for. It's really hard to tell how many people have been killed. Depending on where you go to, official sources, they're usually pretty low. If you go to independent organizations, they are sometimes as high as 50 or 60 people killed in the last 6 weeks or so. So there are some NGOs that are helping locate those people who are unaccounted for. One of them is called Temblores, Temblores. There is another one that is the Corporación Jurídica Libertad. And then there is yet another one is called the Fundación Nidia Erika Bautista. And these are all NGOs that are trying to help those who are being victimized by the response to the protests.
Yeah, thank you so much for all that background and for pointing out those resources as well. And I did want to ask you real quick about, so it seems like there's almost kind of a paradoxical response to the situation down there in Colombia right now, because on the one hand, you have that really, aggressive response from the riot police, from the police in that regard that you talked about, that's, pretty resistant of the movement. But then on the other hand, you do have, the government has seemed to be fairly responsive, at least to some of the demands, made by the protesters. That tax bill that you mentioned was withdrawn. A controversial healthcare bill and a controversial defense spending bill were also withdrawn. And the one minister you mentioned earlier and a few other people from the cabinet have also resigned in response to the protests. So it's kind of it's kind of that paradoxical situation. But I just wanted to ask, how optimistic you were feeling about, the potential for these movements to really bring about some more of that long-term, like, substantial change, given that responsiveness to some of the demands thus far.
That's really hard to know where they're going right now. So there was a committee formed, the National Strike Committee, El Comité de Paro Nacional, and they have been meeting with the government. I think now the talks are suspended because some of the demands are not being met. But what I would say is that I have never seen anything like this in Colombia. We have had a very turbulent past, between the guerrilla wars, the war on drugs, and it goes back between the two parties, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, all the way back to the 19th century. They have been killing each other, and there has been widespread violence, more or less throughout the history of Colombia. And there has been a lot of social injustice and economic inequality in Colombia. But I have never seen anything like the movement we are seeing today. This is the first time that you really feel like a lot of the groups, a lot of the actors, a lot of the segments of the population who have historically not had a voice in all these processes are really saying we are fed up and we are not going to stop until our requests, our demands are met. So now I think this is the first time that you see really a country-wide movement that is saying enough is enough and we will need to resolve this situation. How easily resolve are those problems? Those are really issues that go back, as I said, decades and maybe hundreds of years that probably won't be resolved in weeks or months or even years, but at least you can feel that the government now is really being forced to listen. Also, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is in the country right now. That's something that the government initially resisted or tried to delay. They are now in the country, and they are meeting with the National Strike Committee and the government to try to find a common ground. So I think this is something that has really, which I think has happened with COVID-19 everywhere in the world, is that it has accelerated many processes and it has really brought to the surface many underlying tensions in society. And I think there's we won't turn, there's no turning back for any country in the world, and definitely we are seeing that in Colombia.
Perfect. And thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about what was going on and how people can help. And as we wrap, can you just talk about a little bit about the Juneteenth event that One Hood and City of Asylum is doing on this Friday?
Absolutely. So, most of the things I have said, of course, are my personal opinions up to this point. So I can put my City of Asylum hat, taking my Colombian citizen hat off, and then put my City of Asylum hat. So yes, on this Friday, June 18th, we're going to have a wonderful event at the Samsonia Way tent. we are doing all of our programming outdoors because of the pandemic. We decided that this was the safest way to do it. So there is a large tent that is located on Samsonia Way here in Pittsburgh North Side. And we are co-sponsoring this event that is going to feature also Michael Owuna, Larry Osei Mensa, Orange Barrel Media, and the Pittsburgh Glass Center, and is going to be from 4 to 8 p.m. this coming Friday, and is going to be celebrating Black art in Pittsburgh arts, as Liberation is in celebration of Juneteenth. There's going to be art and music and food, and it's going to be a great celebration. So I would like to invite everyone to this wonderful event.
Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you on Friday. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ryan to introduce our next guest. Thank you so much, Andres.
Thank you, Miracle. Thank you, Ryan. And thanks to One Hood for the invitation today and for the event on Friday, which of course is going to be one of your events.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Andres. So on that note, we'll be moving on to our second guest of the evening. As mentioned earlier, we'll be joined by our very own Farouk Al-Said, who's going to be talking about the ongoing Indigenous issues in Canada, specifically focused on those recent discoveries of mass burial sites of Indigenous youth at the residential Indigenous schools all around Canada. On that note, we can go ahead and bring Farouk into the stream.
That brother handsome. That brother handsome, man. That's a good picture. That's a good picture. Let me say, estoy aquí en Salvador, con todo colombiano. Here in solidarity with all the Colombians. You know what I mean? Hearing a brother speak, is deep. You know what I mean? Just because there's a shared struggle. You know what I mean? That these Black and brown people across the globe are experiencing right now. These Indigenous people are experiencing right now, and it's real. Yeah, it's real. So that was dope having them on.
Yeah, and so we're having this conversation. We know last week, almost 2 weeks ago, there was a discovery of the first of a couple of burial sites in various schools in Canada, where over 200 remains of Indigenous children were found, similar to here in Pennsylvania at the Pennsylvania Resettlement School, where there were hundreds of Indigenous folks who were murdered. And during this conversation, Farouk, you had disclosed this was something that you were very, well aware about, something that you had grew up knowing. And so can you just talk to our audience about the way the Canadian government has historically created and caused genocide amongst the Indigenous populations?
Yeah, absolutely. So the parliament, the government of Canada is still a white supremacist structure. And I think people, whenever they hear Canada, they think of this utopia where democracy goes right. And I know in classrooms it's taught in problems of democracy courses that Canada is what happens when democracy goes right. That's the ongoing joke. And that's made at the expense of the Indigenous people and the First Nations people of Canada. And it's really a disrespectful joke because the genocide has, it has been perpetuated. And there's skirmishes and things that happen in real time, throughout the history of Canada. Even in today, there's instances of alcoholism and poisoning of water supplies and things like that, that aren't strange. It's not dissimilar to what happens in the States. You get me? This specific instance where 215 bodies of children were discovered in British Columbia. Unfortunately, this is just the tip of the iceberg for the Crown, for the Parliament, for the country of Canada, and this is a scar that has never fully healed with the Indigenous community. As a Black Indigenous person of Canada, my grandfather was a Black Mohawk from Quebec, and I hesitated when I got my Montreal hat on today. I hesitated wearing this, knowing that I was going to speak about this, but this is something that has been, part and parcel with the expedition and the creation of Dominion and thusly Canada for 300 years. And this atrocity, even though Prime Minister Trudeau called it, all these nice adjectives and all these fancy words that were supposed to give grievances and, consolement to the families and the ancestors. This is who Canada is. And at the end of the day, this is who white supremacy in the West is and what it looks like. The suffrage and the exploitation and the punishment and the enslavement and the just the torture of Black and brown people. And that's what it is. And it's amazing to me that in 2021, people are just now discovering this about residential schooling, about these problems that aren't endemic, but implemented to the native people of Canada.
Yeah, and so on that note, just you mentioning how surprised you are that a lot of people are kind of just discovering this issue. And one major misconception related to that I think a lot of people have is that this mistreatment, all these atrocities related to the indigenous communities is more of a relic of the distant past. It's something that hasn't been tangibly at play for a long time. That's obviously not the case in this situation, especially with the last of these schools not even closing until the mid 1990s. Yeah, and so you said earlier this is something that you've been aware about for a long time, for a lot of your life. So I don't know to what extent that's as much of a common misconception in Canada. But how do you really see as being the most effective way as far as combating that misconception, educating people on that issue, that this is something that is very recent, very current, still ongoing in a lot of different ways?
Yeah, so the first thing I would like to say is like you highlighted, these issues, these schoolings, the residential schoolings have been operable up into the mid 90s. And if you look at your history books, and you could check Time magazine for this specific, it made a cover of it, 11 July 1990, when the Oka crisis happened, where the the indigenous Mohawk people had a standoff against the Quebec law enforcement and the Canadian Armed Forces. And this is actual declaration of war upon from Canada upon the Mohawk people. This really happened. This is 1990 over traditional sacred Mohawk land that they wanted to turn into a golf course in Oka, Quebec. This is OKA, the Oka crisis. This just happened. And they celebrate the memorial of it on 11 July every year, and it lasted 3 or 4 months, I believe, where there were bodies dropped on both sides. This is something that the reality of it is, just like in the States, these indigenous peoples were basically told where they could and couldn't go on their own land. And people think that in Canada, because First Nations people, Canada is the second largest country in the world by landmass, that the First Nations people are just running around like happy, like they were 5, 6, 7, 800 years ago, 1,000 years ago. No, I mean, they're still in the government constituency and they're given free land, but there's caveats and there's tariffs and things like that attached to it. And what makes Canada's white supremacy so insidious, much like it is in Australia, is they've effectively hidden it from the world. They're giving you this guise of inclusivity and this guise of diversity and everything like that. Oh, come to Toronto, just like the States, or come to Vancouver, Vancouver's like the States, or come to Montreal. All right, well, don't come to Montreal, but they don't want you there. But they give you all these different kind of things to come across the border and try poutine and maple syrup and all these things, and it's great. And then you see what's happening to the indigenous people. And you're not really taught about it in school. You're taught about none of it. You're taught about the Northwest Territories and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and you're taught about some of the where the Algonquin and the Iroquois and some of these things here and there, but it's really superfluous. It's all substance. I mean, symbolism over substance. Doesn't really mean anything because there's no change made, and that's why we have these people lobbying now for this recompense from the Crown and from Parliament to take accountability at the very least, to say, hey, I mean, even the Pope in Canada, or whoever, the Catholic person was like, yo, this is wow. We gotta have some accountability. And I think that where Canada will trump, no pun intended, United States of America, is they will offer apologies, whether they mean anything. They will admit wrongdoing on public television, and that I think in the court of public opinion goes a little bit further.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was wondering, I look at how are, 'cause I know you're still in contact with people in Canada and all over the world. Like, how are people like coming together to like demand a better response from the government and to whether it's reparations, an apology? What is the indigenous communities asking and demanding?
You know, that's kind of a loaded question. Because what
Well,
the
I'll
go ahead.
maybe I'll rephrase it. What are some of the demands that people are asking, and some of the things that you're seeing from people in Canada?
Yeah, some of the things that I've been seeing, what the indigenous people are asking is what they deserve. They deserve acknowledgement. They deserve equality. They deserve equity. They deserve reparations. They deserve freedom. They deserve their land back. They deserve acknowledgement to the fact that, you know, a centuries long atrocity was co-signed by the paperwork of the country that allowed them to essentially rape, beat, and torture the culture and the language out of these people and sacrifice them for medical experiments. So, you know, what they're asking for is not that much dissimilar to what Black people are asking for in the States. To get me, what I'm seeing is a lot of galvanizing, and I'm seeing a lot of social justice groups and a lot of organizers going to British Columbia and going to these areas that are traditionally populated by indigenous people and demanding not only recompense, but demanding justice. And that's the thing. And with Prime Minister Trudeau being someone of the people, um, at the bare minimum, he has to acquiesce these people and do everything he can to soothe over these wounds that have been existing in Canada since its inception.
And then another you know, demand that I've seen commonly made in response to a lot of this is simply just, you know, investigating more of the grounds of these schools. You know, searching for more of these sites, just as a means of providing, you know, some degree of closure for a lot of these families. You know,
Absolutely.
given as Miracle mentioned, you know, at the beginning of your segment, just that, you know, this was not just a Canadian issue. Residential schools were also very widespread in the U.S. and actually, you know, originated here. So do you anticipate any sort of widespread mounting pressure for you know those same types of investigations of these sites in America? You know, do you see that amounting to anything, you know, in response to a lot of these discoveries in Canada?
You know, as I said before, man, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Unfortunately, this is one of them situations where you knock at the devil's door long enough, somebody's going to answer. With Canada and England, they're part and parcel of the same system. Whereas I said they will do things better than, you know, the states will, they are so far behind um, civil rights. Canada and England both are so far behind the states in civil rights. So this is going to be a very slow, drawn out process. It's going to be a lot of feet dragging. And, you know, there's going to be inquisitions and inquiries, and the prime minister or like the minister of, you know, whatever investigation office that they champion to look into this will, you know, file an edict and, you know, go through some bureaucratic motion. It's all pomp and circumstance. And I'm sure some things will be uncovered. But when it really comes down to it is, do they have an incentive to create opportunity and facilitate change and, you know, acknowledge the fact that, hey, listen, you know, we took a page from America's book and really, you know, rained hell on these people, and now we have to write a new history. Will Canada do it? No, I don't believe so.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and your perspective, and like educating our audience on everything that's happening with the Indigenous populations in Canada. Just for a plug, do you want to talk about what you have coming up this week with some of the One Hood programming?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you can find me in a lot more humorous and comical sense on Wednesday with This Week on White Supremacy, where I'm not as heavy. But anytime I get to talk about something like this, you know, I'm always going to take the sunglasses off and talk to the people that, you know, directly. And also Friday, you know, the brother was just chatting that we have our Juneteenth celebration. And, you know, we're going to take what Miracle likes to call is a day of Black joy and celebration. We're gonna do that. We're gonna get some Caribbean vibes. I'm gonna get some chickpeas. I'm gonna get some rum cake, and that, you get me. We're gonna have a good time at City of Asylum. There's gonna be some good music, some powerful art. And yeah, man. And I'm also in a sneaker battle on my Instagram. So, help me out to win some more sneakers that I actually don't need, but I still need them. It's an international sneaker battle. I'm doing things.
Thank you so much. Hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Bye, twin. I'll talk to you soon. Peace, Ryan.
And I'll turn it back over to Ryan so he can introduce our next guest.
Absolutely. Thanks, Miracle. So for our next guest, we'll be joined by Omar Musa from the Palestinian Youth Association of Pennsylvania. Just to talk about, the crisis in Palestine and, a lot of the recent events that have unfolded with that over the past several weeks.
Hey, I heard chickpeas. Farouk, I heard chickpeas.
Yes, so in fact, we try to make sure we have food for people who are vegan, people who do not eat like meat and different things. So we will have curry chickpeas for people on Friday to make sure they are able to get some nourishment while they engage in the Art Liberation event.
I love it. Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been super busy, especially over the past couple of weeks, organizing protests and kind of traveling Pennsylvania to start off this new organization. Can you talk a little bit about what the new association is, and what are some of the things that have driven you to mobilize youth across the Commonwealth?
Absolutely, 100%. So thanks for having me. For those who don't know, my name is Omar Musa. I am a Palestinian. I actually did my master's degree in Jerusalem, so I lived there for about 3 years. All my family's still there, and I am one of the Palestinians that has Israeli citizenship. So we can kind of get into that dynamic later on of what that means. The organization that we're building out, the Palestinian Youth Association of Pennsylvania, is essentially a representative body that's trying to bring together the Palestinian and non-Palestinian people of Pennsylvania to unify around one voice in terms of standing for the justice of the Palestinians and standing against the injustice that's happening to them by the state of Israel, and also building those coalitions out with our people of color and other people that are being just as so oppressed, so that we can have one voice and kind of moving that forward. So the reason I wanted to focus on the youth really is because we have a lot of elders in the community, the Palestinian community myself. So when I say Pennsylvania, the areas that I'm focusing on are Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, and then from there kind of moving into Allentown and Philadelphia later on. So Philadelphia already has kind of like a stable Palestinian community to an extent. We are more scattered, right? We don't really have a strong connection in terms of our social or political impact. But there's a lot of people from elders and young people that are looking for a platform to kind of make that impact. So my moves is essentially trying to figure out, how do I create that initiation to bring these people together and bring them around a unified voice, so that we can build the coalitions that we need, develop the education that we need, and impact policy that's going to, stand up for the justice of the Palestinians, essentially.
Yeah, thank you for elaborating and providing some background, on your reasoning for organizing all that, on how that's, playing out thus far. And I just wanted to ask you about, so, last month at one of the marches that you participated in Harrisburg, related to all of that organizing, one of the main points you made was, you spoke on your belief that America's greatest misconception of, all the conflicts, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is that it's a conflict between two equal parties. You just spoke on that being, one of the largest misconceptions, surrounding those circumstances. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to reiterate that point and elaborate on that.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we do come into contact with when you're standing up for this issue is this concept that there's equivalency between Palestinians, who are civilians that are being occupied, and the Israeli government, which is a systematic, occupational force, right? So one of the things that we kind of have to fight against is changing this paradigm, where we see one force as an occupier and the other as an occupied, and understand how we go about this. right? So one of the examples I want to give is when you look at what kind of led to this flare up, if you may. It is all of the evictions, or specifically the evictions that are happening in Jerusalem, in the town or the village of Sheikh Jarrah. And what's very important to understand about that is you basically have these families that live in Jerusalem that are being forcibly evicted or pushed out of their homes, expelled from their homes, because and these are the words of the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, because they want to create layers of Jews in the area so that this piece of land is not lost in any future peace deals, essentially. So that's just the definition of ethnic cleansing as you have it. There's actually, you can read about it in 2000, like the master planning of Jerusalem, and this is at the highest levels of government, is to make sure that the demographic of Jerusalem is always a 70-30 split between Jews and Arab Palestinians, right? And then on top of that, what's important to understand is a lot of the pushback that we get. Oh, let me get back to the flare up, right? So these people are being forcibly evicted from their homes or actually expelled from their homes. So there's a large stand up to protest this type of injustice naturally, right? Like what else would you do? And the response to that is extreme police violence, rubber bullets, people being thrown in jail, beaten in their own homes, skunk water, X, Y, and Z, like, everything that you can actually have. And after this, the protests continue because these civilians are standing up for themselves. Now, what's important to understand is all these Palestinian Arabs that live in Jerusalem, they're not citizens of Israel, right? And the other thing is they're not citizens of any Palestinian entity, right? All that exists in the West Bank is a Palestinian Authority, but those in Jerusalem are not. There's no jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem. So who do these people have to go to? Who do they have to go to when they're being forcibly, expelled from their homes? And let's say they wanted to deal with it in a diplomatic way. Other than protesting and standing up for their rights, they have no judicial body to go to, right? Because the Israeli government is systematically trying to push them out themselves. See what I'm saying? So what do they have instead of citizenship? They have something called Jerusalem residency. So that residency, basically what it says is that you can live here and pay taxes to us, the Israeli government, but you have no rights essentially. And that residency is dependent on us kind of approving it in time. Like if you leave for a certain amount of time from Jerusalem and you have residency, that residency can be revoked from you, right? So there's really no outlets for these people to diplomatically seek out their rights. And that's another reason why, our organizations here are so important. Not to just put pressure on our politicians and put pressure on our representation, because America is enabling this through the $4 billion that are being sent to Israel. And on top of that, just look at recently what's going on. On top of that $4 billion, recently came up with $2 more billion that they wanted to send after this, 11-day strike on Gaza and all of the things that are happening. So we couldn't get $600 more in unemployment or $600 more in stimulus help for our own citizens. But real quick, we found $2 billion that we're going to go enable this type of violence that's happening, on the other side of the world. So when you talk about equivalencies, like your question, not only is Israel the occupying force, it's one of the most sophisticated armies in the world. They're also enabled by the most sophisticated army in the world, and also one of the largest in terms of economic output and GDP in the world, which is the USA, right? And not just monetarily or financially, but also diplomatically, right? So when you look at, for example, the United Nations security resolutions and councils, when Palestinians try to reach out to the international community for some type of justice for what's happening to them, consistently, the USA has been the only veto that is preventing any of these things from being pushed forward, right? So on two scales of equivalency, one, you have a civilian population of Palestinians, and they're also split up by this occupation. And we could speak on that in terms of Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in the West Bank, those Palestinians in Jerusalem that I spoke to you about, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinian refugees around the world. Those are all civilians, and they're being attacked and striked and occupied by, a systematic government of violence, and they're being enabled by the United States of America. So there's no equivalency at all in these manners. And unless we kind of switch that paradigm, the media is going to continue to push and essentially brainwash and manipulate a lot of people in misunderstanding the situation and what it is.
Thank you so much for having a conversation. It's a lot of, I know it's a lot to break down in such a short amount of time. But we also saw that there was a couple of people who introduced legislation to actually remove the aid to Gaza because of what they said what could be stolen for Hamas. And so for a lot of people who really do not understand how agencies work and how the government works, can you just talk a little bit about why it's about the blockade and why it's so important that support and aid goes to Gaza residents?
Absolutely, 100%. So one important thing before I do get into Gaza is also this hyper focus, and as it should be, right? There's some that hyper focus on Gaza, because those are the individuals that are being extremely impacted. Because we're talking about lives being destroyed, right? 90 children being killed, not just being killed. You have many orphans that were newly made, many people that need amputations, many people that are still under the rubble that we don't know about. So we should hyper focus on these international human violations and this like pure disgusting murder, essentially what it is, and this violence. But what's interesting you see is how quickly Israel and the US media wants to focus on Hamas when a lot of things are not spoken about, like those residents of Jerusalem that were being expelled from their homes. What happened to them, right? Like the military occupation in the West Bank of 3 million Palestinians. What happened to them, right? Like the second-class citizenship and apartheid that exists for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. What's going on with them, right? All of these things, if they were not scapegoated by the retaliation of forces in Gaza, right, then they would actually have to be on the table and we'd have to discuss them. Then we would realize that our principles in the United States, right, our moral or democratic principles are not being upkept in this so-called democracy in Israel, which is not a democracy, it's an ethnocracy essentially, right? It's a democracy if you're a certain ethnicity. And then for the rest of the people, it's not a democracy. But in Gaza, yeah, since 2006, Gaza has been under Israeli blockade, meaning that the sky, the water, the electromagnetic system, the borders, everything is controlled by Israel. Imports, exports, people, transportation, the population registry, every aspect of it. Electricity in the area is limited to 2-3 hours a day for the average family. The average age, like the median age in Gaza is, I think, somewhere around like 1920, but it's years less than the world's average age. There's about 2.2 million people in Gaza, and the size of Gaza is about the size of Philadelphia, right? It's about 140 square miles. So it's very tiny, one of the most highly dense areas in the world. So and what's important to know is of those 2.2 million people, most of them are actually refugees. They're not from Gaza originally. So in 1948 and 1967, when there was in 1948, for example, when there was 800,000 Palestinians that were expelled from their homes because of the violence that was occurring. More than 500 villages were destroyed in the region. A lot of them went to that area. They were kind of not just went, they were like pushed into Gaza. They were pushed into West Bank and the surrounding Arab countries. So until today, those families grew and they're there now. And that's why it's so highly dense. So in these circumstances where you have a population that's a refugee population that's completely dependent on the international community for their education, their health, and their food. Their imports and exports are completely controlled by the occupying force that is, their neighbor or the one that, is occupying them. All of their imports and exports, their GDP, all those things are controlled by someone who views you as the enemy and doesn't see you as a human. That's why it's so easy for Israel to destroy millions and billions of dollars of infrastructure, destroy thousands and thousands of lives. Like you can see in this last flare-up, over 300 people were killed. In 2014, there was thousands of people killed in Gaza. There was not only an air attack, but there was also a ground attack. They actually infiltrated and they killed thousands and thousands of human beings. So when it comes to us supporting them, like one, we got to continue to use our voices. What we saw this time was a huge benefit of social media. How on the ground realities were being shown and broadcasted by the people living there. In the past, these things were hidden from us and the media was completely biased, so we didn't get to see them. So you had like this huge support because we were seeing what's actually happening, something that we know about because we've been seeing it our whole lives, but something that's now being, opened up to the eyes of the world. So that's something that we, have to continue to do.
Thank you so much for sharing all that information. And I know it's always, heavy to talk about the subject for people who are going through it. As you are organizing and launching, how do people get in contact with you? How do people join and support the association? I know you said this is a newer initiative, so how can people contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you can follow me on Omar Musa _. That's my Instagram. On Facebook, Omar Musa. Pretty soon, we'll have our website up and running for PYAP, Palestinian Youth Association of Pennsylvania, and our Instagram. So, if you want to contact me now, get some more information, set up some meetings, or talk about how we can work together, feel free to contact me personally. But as we move forward and we get our organization up and running, just through the website and through the Instagram will probably be the best direction. So it's I know I probably went over, but what's very important for Pittsburgh, what I found when I moved to Pittsburgh, there's a lot of sister city programs between America and Israel. And when I got to Pittsburgh, what I found out is Pittsburgh's sister city is a city called Carmiel, which is essentially an Israeli settlement that was built on the land of my grandfathers. Right. So I'm from a city in the north called Deir el-Asad, and right across from us, most of the land that was owned by not just Deir el-Asad, but Majd al-Krum and al-Bi'na. Those are basically 3 towns in one. They had a big strip of land right across from us that was all confiscated and taken after 1948. And in the 1950s, a settlement was built there, which now is, about 30 or 40,000, Israelis living there. And Pittsburgh actually has a sister city relationship with them. So part of the thing that we are trying to do is create a program called the Forgotten Sister City Program, which holds our local and national cities accountable for, if you're going to have that relationship with these Israeli cities at the detriment of the Palestinians, then we have to hold you responsible to also try to build those same economic, educational, and a tourist or whatever the situation in terms of like how you interact and how you share resources. So there's a lot of work to be done in central Pennsylvania and organizing and in Pittsburgh. But again, coalition building, policy development, and education are our 3 largest priorities at the moment.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about the organizing that you're doing. And we look forward to seeing you this weekend. So again, thank you so much for taking time out to be on our program.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate We'll talk pretty soon, as we always do. But also, I'm looking forward to the chickpeas photo, if you're still listening. Thank you, guys.
Yep. Thank you for joining us.
Peace.
Yeah. And so on that note, yeah, thank you, Omar, again for joining us, for providing all that information on the background of that situation and all the organizing that you and your organization are doing around that. Yeah, we can go ahead and move to our final guest of the episode, Mieza Gede from Omna Tigray, who's going to be talking to us about the ongoing crisis in the Tigray region in the north of Ethiopia. Yeah, so we're really excited to have her join us as well tonight. We can go ahead and bring her into the stream also.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm sorry for my rusty voice. I just came back from a 2 days long protest and have been chanting, so I lost my voice. I hope you can hear me.
Oh,
yeah,
you're
absolutely.
fine.
Thank you. You're good. You're good. So we actually had a guest on back in, I believe, sometime in November or December, to talk about the back then what was the current state of the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia. So if you could just start off by providing us with some of the major developments that have occurred in the past several months since then, what the current state of that situation is right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So there has been an active war that was waged against the people of Tigray and their government on November 1st, when the world was literally busy anticipating the election, the presidential election result here in the U.S. The unelected prime minister of Ethiopia colluded with a foreign country called Eritrea and waged war against one of the constituencies of the Ethiopian country. So for the past 7 months now, the people of Tigray have been under constant bombardment. Drones have been used. Drones that were sponsored by United Arab Emirates have been used to destroy villages and cities across the region of Tigray. Rape is being used as a weapon of distraction. It's being used to not only to terrorize and violate the women's body in Tigray, but also to ensure that the people of Tigray and their identity doesn't continue to reproduce. At the same time, starvation is also being used as a weapon of distraction, as the Ethiopian federal government continues to deny unfettered and hinder humanitarian access to international aid workers. But at the same time, Eritrean troops continue to loot and to destroy whatever resource the people of Tigray have had that could have helped them to survive. In addition to that, almost 90%, over 90% of the total population of Tigray currently faces a man-made famine. The number is quite staggering. It's 5.2 million people are facing a man-made famine, and people are already dying in their sleep. These numbers are not numbers that are only, these are not numbers that I am making up. These are numbers that were reported by the UN and by different international media organizations, including the CNN. In addition to that, all the developmental gains within Tigray that the people of Tigray have worked so hard in the past over 30 plus years have completely been destroyed. Hospitals are destroyed, universities, colleges, schools are being used as centers for military men. So what's happening in Tigray is quite devastating. And at the same time, it's very sad that the world doesn't even know enough, doesn't even know what exactly is happening, because the Ethiopian federal government made sure that internet was cut down, made sure that phone services were cut down, so that the people that are being attacked won't be able to tell the world what exactly is happening to them. So these are some of the very devastating things that are happening.
And I know Secretary Blinken has talked about the need to find peace and the need, to restore it. But has there really been any type of international movement to actually stop the war that's happening?
To our surprise, there hasn't been enough pressure from the international community. The international community, including the US government, has been expressing its concerns, has been trying to plead with the genocidal regime in Ethiopia to stop the ongoing suffering of the innocent people of Tigray. However, there hasn't been anything tangible. There hasn't been any action taken against these genocidal forces that continue to violate international humanitarian laws and other relevant laws in order to attain their political objective. However, the State of Department has labeled what's happening as ethnic cleansing. At the same time, the UN Security Council has met multiple times to discuss the crisis. However, China and Russia continue to block any and every initiative other members of the UN Security Council are trying to take in order to stop the ongoing bloodshed in Tigray. But we're hoping that the US government and other members of the European Union would take unilateral or bilateral action that could actually stop the genocide. The US government just recently announced a flight restriction on all members of the conflict. But to be quite honest, this genocidal force, they don't need to fly out of the country in order to exterminate the people. So we're still calling for stronger actions to be taken, but there hasn't been any apart from, words.
Sorry, go ahead, Nico.
Okay. I know you. No, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was just going to say, in response to your closing point there, you and your organization have been advocating for much stronger action from the U.S. and from the international community. There's, your website has several demands related to that listed. So if there's, any major demands that you would like to highlight at this point, as far as, actions you'd like to see taken in support of the people of Tigray.
Yeah, so we're basically calling for key actions. The first thing is for cessation of hostilities. There needs to be a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire. In addition to that, there needs to be immediate withdrawal of all the foreign forces that are currently invading Tigray and causing all the havoc and distraction. At the same time, we're calling for unfettered and unrestricted humanitarian access to all parts of Tigray so that people don't continue to die of starvation. At the same time, we're also calling for the restoration of the elected government of Tigray, because over 2.7 million Tigrayans have already voted for a political party that they deem is fit enough to administer them. So these are some of our demands, but we're also calling for the international community to facilitate an all-inclusive national dialogue within Ethiopia, whereby nation and nationals will be represented by their respective political parties in order to resolve whatever political issue there might be. So in order for all of these things to happen, the US government particularly can do a lot to make sure that these things happen. And one of the things the US government can do is they can impose arms embargo on the Ethiopian and Eritrean government so that they don't continue to buy weapons of distraction and destroy the whole ethnic city in Tigray. In addition to that, we're also calling on the US government to declare a no-fly zone on Tigray because the genocidal forces have been using chemical weapons to attack the people of Tigray. So these things are things that need to be done in the immediate, unless the world is willing to step aside and see an entire population wiped out from the world. So these are some of the things we're calling for, but the issue is very complicated and it requires political willingness by the international community because, to be honest, all the policymakers, they know what exactly is happening, they know why it's happening, and they know what the solution is. But what's lacking is the political will. What's lacking is, the determination and dedication to protect civilians and innocent people. So we hope, your listeners, your audience could help us in putting enough pressure on their respective senators and Congress people so that they can be forced to do the right thing.
And I know you talked about cutting the access. So one of the differences between some of our previous guests, we're talking about Colombia and Palestine and Canada, is we don't see the videos, the live social media protests because the cell service is cut off. And so how are you able to keep galvanizing, keep pushing? It's been over 100 days. You're using social media, you're creating these organizations. How have you been able to show people what's happening on the ground and to get people to care, to call their senators, to call their elected officials?
Yeah, I think one of the most effective thing the genocidal Ethiopian government did is to cut down the communication channels, because people usually don't really trust or believe what they can't see. So we're not able to show the magnitude of the destruction, the suffering that's happening on 100% scale. But so far we have been able to, to speak to some of our family members that have fled the war zone and are currently in Sudan. We have also been able to hear to see reports that were documented by some journalists that were given very limited access to Tigray. So there is ample evidence, there is ample videos and pictures to mobilize the community. So, but at the same time, I think whenever we talk about this kind of injustice and atrocities, people should believe the victims. People should believe those that are at the receiving end of this genocide. So the stories we share on our social media accounts, the stories we share whenever we go to this kind of opportunities, are stories we heard from our family members, from our close friends who are either currently suffering and dying in the dark, or are currently in Sudan and other parts of the world. So this is how we have been mobilizing our community, as well as allies of the Tigray people. But there are very ample convincing videos and reporting that has been done by the CNN, Al Jazeera, and others. So for anyone interested, all they have to do is just Google the Tigray word, and then a lot of evidence will pop up that would convince you, to stand by the people of Tigray.
And then I did want to ask also, because this is another point that you mentioned earlier, if you could just elaborate a little bit on what all the controversy has been surrounding the elections in Ethiopia over the past year, with claims of them being undemocratic, and then I believe with them being delayed from March to now sometime this fall. So if you could just provide some context on that as well.
Yeah, so while answering this question is very important because it gives light into why exactly there is a genocide within Ethiopia. So the genocide is happening because people have ideological difference on how Ethiopia should look like. On the one hand, you have people who want to have an ethnic federalism, a type of governance that would allow nations and nationalities to be self-administered, to have the right to self-determination, to be governed by people who know their culture, who are from their own community. On the other hand, you have a group of people that won't have a centralized government, a government that doesn't recognize people's innate differences, a government that doesn't give people the right to be self-administered. So that is where the contention came. And the people of Tigray are group of people that have fought for over 17 years in the past history of Tigray to preserve their right self-determination. Although we're minorities within Ethiopia, but we want to be respected for who we are. We want to coexist peacefully with others. That's what we wanted previously. And after 17 years of war, we managed to overthrow a military dictatorship that was literally forcing everybody to speak one language, to have only one culture, one religion. So after the 17 years of conflict, the people of Ethiopia, along with Tigrayans and others, were able to overthrow that military dictatorship and formed an ethnic federalism through which they were able to coexist. But once the current and elected prime minister came to power, he brought this sentiment of dismantling that federalism, literally destroying the constitutional framework that gave people the power to coexist and the right to be who they are. And then now he's wanting to create an Ethiopia that doesn't really recognize people's differences. And in order to do that, he used COVID-19 as an excuse and unconstitutionally extended his power by canceling the election that was supposed to happen on November of 2019. And after that, there has been a lot of discussion about, we need to have our election, because no matter the challenge, Ethiopia has never ever postponed an election, because you have to follow the constitutional framework in order to get constitutional legitimacy to administer the country. But Abiy Ahmed, the unelected prime minister of Ethiopia, knew very well that the kind of ideology he has is not welcomed by so many nation and nationalists in the country, and so he wanted to create a platform or an environment that would enable him to grab the power and stay there. So that's what he did. And ever since COVID-19 became a thing, he has been postponing the election for so many times. And now you have a sham election that is supposed to happen in a few days, whereby there is no any viable political opposition that could challenge the prime minister, because all the viable political oppositions have been either arrested or are killed, assassinated, and the people of Tigray, for all reasons and purposes, are not part of this election because they're being exterminated in that dark. There is an active genocide happening in the country, but the prime minister doesn't really care about that. So he's planning to go ahead and have an election that only includes him and other parts that have the same kind of ideology with him. So this is not really an election. It's rather it's a sham procedure that is being put in order to gain constitutional legitimacy so that he can stay in power by forcefully. This is what's happening. The election doesn't really hold any water, and the US government as well as the European Union have clearly expressed their concerns about this, and they decided not to send observers. So this election is not even being observed by any international community except the African Union, which is another coalition of dictators.
Thank you so much for talking about the election and how it relates to the ongoing war. For people who are wanting to get involved to help amplify your demands, what are some of the ways they can get in contact with you, some of the ways that they can support the movement to stop the war in Tigray?
Yeah, so you can follow us on all social media at Omna Tigray. Omna Tigray is a non-profit and non-partisan organization that was established in response to the ongoing genocide in Tigray. We do our very best to amplify the plight of the people of Tigray, but also other oppressed and marginalized groups in the world. So we'd love to collaborate with any organization, with any group of people that have, the same objective of freeing and helping the oppressed, helping the vulnerable people. So we'd love for you to contact to reach us. You can also follow me at Maaza_G_ on Twitter. That's where I do most of this kind of interaction. But the most important thing I wanted to say is the Ethiopian government is deploying a lot of money. They have hired more than 4 lobbyists in order to confuse the international community into inaction. But we're minorities. We don't have the manpower nor the financial resources to have this kind of lobbyist group. So we depend on each and everyone's voice to in our fight against genocide, in our fight against ethnic cleansing and a man-made famine. So please do your very best to, first of all, educate yourselves about what's happening, and after that, become an ally. Use your voice. There is so much power in what you can do, and you can save the people of Tigray from being exterminated in the dark. And you can get all of the detailed information about what's happening, on how you can help us, if you go to our website at omnatigray.org.
Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know you said you're still out protesting and organizing. Please let us know if we can be of any support in the future.
Yeah, will do. Thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity. We're very grateful that you were willing to provide a platform, because we feel alone. We have been screaming for the past 7 months. We have been talking about what's happened to our family members, but no one seems to care. No one seems to pay attention. So the very fact that you guys wanted to bring us here so that we can tell the world what's happening, it's encouraging. So I want to say thank you very much. Your platform means the world to the people that are dying in the dark. And I encourage everybody to stay engaged and to call and speak with your local representatives, the senators, the Congress people, because there is a House resolution that is going to be on the table very soon, and we're going to need everyone's vote to make it happen so that the genocide could stop. So please call your senators and Congress people and tell them what needs to be done in order to stop the genocide happening in Tigray, because the world failed Rwanda in the early 90s, and now the world is failing the people of Tigray. We said never again after Rwanda, but it's exactly happening in Tigray right now. So we have a moral responsibility and obligation to stand by the people of Tigray, not just because I'm from Tigray, but because what's happening is inhuman and it shouldn't happen to anybody in the 21st century. So I just encourage everybody to stay connected, engaged, and do whatever you can to support the people of Tigray. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming on. And I hope for people who've been watching, you understand how all of these stories and experiences are interconnected with what's going on here in the United States and even here in Pennsylvania, how politicians have used COVID-19 for their own political benefits and detriments, and how a lot of our nations are impeding peace and progress. And so it's very important that I know a lot of times it's easy for us to stick in our own silos, but it's very important for us to understand what's going on in the world globally, and how our policies impact literally the lives and well-being of people abroad. So I hope that if you taken anything away from the program tonight, it's that we are all connected, and our liberation, again, we're all tied together. And so it's very important that we fight together, that we uplift the struggles, and that we demand a world of peace and safety for all people.
Absolutely. And just, going back to one of the points Omar touched on earlier during his segment, it really just speaks to the power of social media in highlighting and establishing a lot of those different connections. We saw it last spring, summer, fall, with, again, what's been termed the George Floyd protests, with protests occurring, of course, all around America, but all over the world in response to that. We saw them in Palestine, Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And now, we're seeing demonstrations in America, on behalf of a lot of these issues. And so it's just, really important we highlight that, really important we keep that momentum going, and have guests on this platform like we did tonight to really provide that background and information, and ways to organize and get involved and provide resources, just to get that information out there to people to really amplify all of that as well, and to again to just establish the interconnectedness of it all on a global scale. So on that note, just wanted to thank all of our guests again for coming on, delivering their really powerful messages, their really informative backgrounds, on all of these different situations and how they really all connect together. And on that note, I'll pass it back to Miracle if she has anything else she has to add, or just wants to jump into the rundown for the rest of this week's programming.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Ryan. Again, we would encourage everyone, especially look at the chat, to get to know different people who are fighting for different issues. A lot of people were very involved in the social media comments on the Facebook and YouTube. And that's how you build community and solidarity. We were talking about, that was the focus of this program. And how you do that is you reach out and you connect with people who may have similar struggles or dissimilar struggles than your own, and you figure out how you can show up and support. And so we do hope that in addition to watching this program, you actually reach out to like our guest who spoke this evening and see how you're able to amplify their message and to show up. That's what we do here with the 100 Media Network, and that's what our purpose is, is to build these liberated communities and bring people together. And so please reach out to us if there's a story we haven't covered or a story you would like us to cover. Please reach out and engage. We're willing to host and have these conversations and share our channels and resources. I know Fruit talked about it earlier, but we do have some different programming coming up tomorrow for what Black Pittsburgh needs to know. At 2:00 on Tuesday, we're talking about Juneteenth, what's going on and why we have to have Juneteenth, and what's going on in our communities and the fights that are happening right now, just about our ability to organize the protest, to call out racism when we see it. So please tune in tomorrow at 2:00. Wednesday, we have This Week in White Supremacy, discussing a lot of things that have been happening just around the country. And so please tune in Wednesday at 6 p.m. Thursday, we have 2 shows for you. A lot of stuff is going on. We know it's heavy to hear about genocide and apartheid and racism. And so we have Thursdays at noon on Tilt. It's our mental health programming with Julius Boatwright and Mama Brown. And we're actually talking about how you can support, protect, and engage with your mental health during these times of unrest and these painful times. We're talking with mental health providers, people who have figured out different ways to combat the negative aspects of mental health. So please make sure you tune in Thursdays at noon, and Thursdays at 7 p.m. we have Ask a Black Doctor. Y'all, COVID is still here. It's still impacting us. We also have flu season. We have people dealing with allergies. And so we know you have a lot of questions. So please make sure you tune in to Ask a Black Doctor this Thursday at 7 p.m. Where we're talking about all things like health and wellness and what questions you need to ask your medical providers as we go back into this reopening. So we thank you so much for joining us. If you are someone who's inclined to, please make sure you register to vote. And also, if you are able to, please make sure we'll post it in the chat. Please make sure you support One Hood Power with a financial contribution. Subscribe to our YouTube, because we're putting this out as labor of love, but we want to make sure we're able to support different entities and organizations. So if you're able to, please make a donation to the One Hood Power organization. We can't thank you so much for everything that you've done. Thank you so much for tuning in and sharing. With that, I will turn it back over to my co-host Ryan to take us out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think as always, you pretty much covered everything, Miracle. But yeah, like you said, for anyone else who has any issue that they would like for us to cover, whether it's something with more of an international focus like this, national, statewide, local, whatever it is, absolutely, reach out, contact us. We would happy to do a segment or an entire episode on any number of issues. So absolutely reach out to us about that. And yeah, just again, thank you to all of our guests for joining us tonight. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and for your continued support of One Hood Power. Thank you.